Welcome to STARSPEAK with astrologer Maureen Richmond. Here's where you'll find the latest news on what's up with the heavens. Looking for the inner message from outer space? This is your place. So join me in welcoming your host, astrologer Maureen Richmond.
Welcome, star friends. This is astrologer Maureen Richmond, and you're listening to STARSPEAK on the UNX Digital Broadcasting Network. Welcome today. This day is November 22, the year 2023. And boy, do I have a show for you tonight. Yeah, tonight we're going to be talking with author Marc Hartzman. He's just released an important book that chronicles the history of the UFO situation and adds some very important information. That's Marc Hartzman, and I'm going to spell that for you because I think you're going to want to look him up after we talk tonight. It's Marc, M-A-R-C, Hartzman, H-A-R-T-Z-M-A-N, M-A-R-C, H-A-R-T-Z-M-A-N. Marc has released just this year a new book titled We Are Not Alone, but this is not his first adventure in the world of publicity and publication about these extraordinary situations and times in which we live these days. Also by Marc Hartzman are the following books, and listen up because you're going to get a real good idea of what's unique about this particular author. Here we go. Chasing Ghosts, a tour of our fascination with spirits and the supernatural. Next, The Big Book of Mars, from ancient Egypt to the Martian, a deep space dive into our obsession with the red planet. Another title, found on eBay, 101 genuinely bizarre items from the world's online yard sale. American Sideshow, an encyclopedia of history's most wondrous and curiously strange performers. Next, God Made Me Do It, true stories of the worst advice the Lord has ever given his followers. Next, the Anti-Social Network Journal, a place for all the thoughts, ideas, and plans you don't want to share. And finally, The Embalmed Head of Oliver Cromwell, a memoir. So with that, welcome Marc Hartzman to STARSPEAK.
Green, appreciate you having me. And thank you for spelling out my name because no one ever gets that right. So I appreciate that.
Well, it's an interesting name, isn't it? Yeah. So, and you've got a lot of interesting things to tell us and to share with us. Marc, you've just released this book, We Are Not Alone, this calendar year. It was October of 2023, right?
Yeah, correct. Just over a month ago.
And your publisher was?
Quirk Books.
Q-U-I-R-K, Quirk Books?
Yeah, exactly.
And you must have worked closely with your editors at Quirk Books to shape the ideas that you brought forth in this book, right?
Yeah, I have a terrific editor. There's so much information, and the book covers quite a lot. So she was helpful, really helpful with organizing some of the information. I kind of went in with, I think originally I had 5 chapters. We ended up cutting down to 4 and kind of shifting a few things around and reorganizing a bit during the other process, which I think worked out really nicely. So yeah, she was great to work with.
Yeah, these chapters that Marc is talking about are worth hearing the titles for, I'll tell you. I've read this book, and it's really a wonderful journey through the history of the UFO movement, starting back in the 1940s. Here are the titles. He has an introduction, then Attack of the Flying Saucers, a modern phenomenon begins. Chapter 2, Close Encounters, Alien Contactees and Abductees. Chapter 3, the phenomenon continues with mass sightings, conspiracies, and flying triangles. Chapter 4 is the search for extraterrestrial intelligence. And in this chapter, he gets into the work of Avi Loeb and some of the others. And finally, the coup de grace, the closing chapter, the truth is out there officially. The government acknowledges UFOs. So those are those titles that you were talking about, Mark, huh?
Yeah, I think it breaks it up nicely, and I like that. That first chapter really kind of gets into like you said, the early history of the modern phenomena, going back to the early 40s, a little bit before 1947, when Kenneth Arnold saw the 9 flying discs that led to the term flying saucers. But it goes back to 42 with the Battle of LA, and then the Foo Fighters, of course, from World War II, and then kind of works its way forward. And scattered through different sections, it touches a little bit on some more ancient possibilities as well.
So this book, I know because I've studied it carefully, is a really good introduction to the field. If anybody in your circle out there in listener land is looking for a good Christmas present to give or to receive, this is a great one because it's really wonderful for people who may be new to the field. It's good also for people who have been researching in this field or reading in this field and going to conferences for quite some time, because it gives a really nice overview of the entire development of the situation. Here on STARSPEAK, we talk about what's underneath the happenings of the UFO movement, the astrological influences that are under the surface. And we look at the astrology of individual figures in in ufology as well. And that's what we're going to be doing tonight. We're going to take a look here at the kind of astrological setup that our author here has and some related ideas. But let's keep talking for right now about this book and what you're doing in it. And so after you set the stage with the history of the movement, where do you go then, Mark?
So that's that first chapter, kind of goes through a bunch of different stories. It covers off on Kenneth Arnold, a few of the other cases, Roswell, of course, Socorro, but it gets into a few. It covers some of the more, I'd say, well-known cases if you're familiar with ufology and the history of the subject, but also hits on a few lesser-known ones of trying to find that balance. Like you said, I think it's a good introduction, but also I think would be enjoyed by people who have read a lot on the subject already. By the way, the book is filled with imagery, lots of artifacts, interesting ephemera, photos, illustrations, and so forth, newspaper clippings. So there's a lot to go through and kind of take in with the book. But it also gets into the contactees and abductees, which I think is a really interesting part of it. The contactees being from the 50s, primarily people who thought that they met Venusians, Martians, people from Saturn, other planets. And mostly the message they were giving was that these meetings were from space people, as they often refer to them, to warn us about the atomic age and the dangers of nuclear weapons as that was developing after World War II. So that was kind of their message, which, whatever you want to believe about them, that was a good message, right? That's something that we should be paying attention to. And it certainly was, I think, a good message to be spreading. And then the abductees kind of takes the idea of contact with extraterrestrials to a whole other level. So again, to a bunch of, well-known and lesser-known stories in that section.
Mark, you've been studying and discussing and treating topics that are off the beaten track for a long time, haven't you?
Yeah, I really have. I love it. I love all the odd pages of history. I actually have a website called weirdhistorian.com where I write about a lot of these things that tend to ultimately end up as a book of mine.
Weird Historian. Okay. That's good. Let's have a look at Mark's own astrology that ties up with his interest in the anomalistic. Now, some of the topics that you've studied have been really pretty out there, haven't there? Strange performers and some of the titles that are, or the topics that are in the books that you published before, right?
Yeah, so the American Sideshow you referenced briefly just now is my second book, and it's a topic I've loved for many years, just fascinated by sideshow performers throughout history. So I had an amazing opportunity to write that book. It covers performers from the mid 1800s up to the early 2000s. Got to meet a ton of interesting people. In fact, I was just chatting with one of them this morning who's a sword swallower. So I love meeting these people and seeing the remarkable things that they can do, and writing about these stories of people who were born with anomalies, and the way they overcame them and were able to make a living, be a star on the stage, travel the world, find love, have families, support themselves. At a time when that would not have been easy without the sideshow. So I love those stories. I find them to be really quite triumphant for the most part. And then, yeah, I mean, you mentioned my book titles. You can see the range of my interest. The Embalmed Head of Oliver Cromwell, a memoir, one of my favorites, that follows the true story of Oliver Cromwell's embalmed head that traveled for 300 years from 1661 to 1960 throughout England. And I tell that story through the POV of the head itself, which was kind of fun. So it's sort of a historical fiction, but does, like I said, follow the real path that the head took. And then the Big Book of Mars is one of my favorites. And that book really goes into a lot of fascinating history about the red planet. It goes back to a lot of the early beliefs in intelligent life on Mars, when a lot of the world's brightest minds truly believed that there was intelligent life there and tried to find ways that we could communicate with them or receive their communications. And that book started to get into the UFO topic a little bit, because by the late 40s, early 50s, there were some beliefs that some of the flying saucers that were being seen may have been piloted by Martians, again, with the idea that maybe they were trying to warn us about the atomic age, or were concerned about their own planet from our own destruction that we might unleash into the solar system. So that was kind of an earlier foray into this topic, but I was so fascinated by that. And I've been fascinated by this topic, since I was a kid, but kind of writing and researching it, started with that book, and I wanted to expand on it and obviously tell so much more of the stories surrounding it. And that's what We Are Not Alone became.
So you have been thinking outside of the box for a long time. As a matter of fact, it's first nature to you. It's not second nature to you. Now, I want to share with the STARSPEAK audience that Marc was born on July 31, the year 1974, at 7:42 a.m. in Denver, Colorado. And I had that information ahead of time coming into tonight's show. And I've had the advantage of studying Marc's astrological chart. And I can tell you that there are certain features of the chart that really tie up very closely with everything he just said. First of all, I'd like to point out that the planet Mars, which he was just talking about, is very powerful in his chart. And there's a very clear reason why, and I think everybody will be able to understand it right away. Mars was rising on the eastern horizon at the time of Marc Hartzman's birth. In astrological lingo, we say Mars is conjunct the ascendant. Mars conjunct the ascendant. The truth of it is, simply stated, Mars was rising over the eastern horizon at the time he made his appearance on this Earth. The astrological hypothesis is that planets that are rising, culminating, setting, or anti-culminating are very powerful in the character or nature or the psychology or even the life path of the individual. And my goodness, here, Mars dominates his chart, and it turns out to be one of the topics to which he gravitates quite naturally and intuitively. And I'm sure he did not do that on the basis of astrology, because that was not part of his study material at that time. This is probably news. He's hearing this for the first time right now.
It is.
Yeah. So the planet Mars was very powerful at the moment of your birth, 7:42 a.m. Your birth chart is calculated on the basis of the month, day, year, and clock time and place. And so it's very specific and describes the astronomical conditions right where you were at the time of your birth. So Mars was really in the mix. Now, that's not all there is about Marc that helps us understand his path as a writer and his spiritual journey. Also, at the time of his birth, Mercury was located 21 degrees of Cancer, and Uranus was located 24 degrees of Libra in the zodiac. That's a separation of about 93 degrees, close enough to an exact 90-degree separation in the zodiac to be termed a square. So he has Mercury square Uranus in his natal chart. Any kinds of squares in anybody's natal chart emphasize the two planets involved. And in this case, it's Mercury, which is the planet of mind, word, thought, communication, and Uranus, the planet of creative thinking, anomalistic occurrences, modern technology, and the acceleration of evolution for self and humanity. Those are some of the things associated with Uranus. So you can see how these themes have actually reflected in his interests and in his life path. So he's got Mercury square Uranus. Marc Hartzman is therefore Uranian from an astrological standpoint. And I'll tell you what, that's so interesting because so are a bunch of other people who are well known in the ufological field. Would you like to hear some of those, Mark?
Yeah, I love hearing all this. Those descriptions are truly spot on. So this is great.
Well, let me tell you what. The list I'm going to read off is some of the people that you talked about in your book. So, STARSPEAK listeners, you're going to get the inside scoop on a lot of things. First off, another Uranian, George Adamski. So he was a pretty imaginative character. Some people think he was a charlatan, but Marc Hartzman does not treat him dismissively in his history. He explains all about what Adamski was into. Well, Adamski was born on April 17, 1891, with the sun at 28 degrees of Aries and Uranus at 29 of Libra, making a tight opposition. So he has Sun opposite Uranus, and that does work to make an individual more creative and less conforming and highly imaginative and activated from the higher levels of consciousness. Also eccentric, and he was all of those things, but so George Adamski, he's a Uranian. Next up, J. Allen Hynek, born May 1, 1910, with Saturn at 28 of Aries and Uranus at 25 of Capricorn, separated by almost exactly 90 degrees and therefore square. Saturn square Uranus, he's Uranian. Who's next? Linda Moulton Howe, born January 20, 1942, with Saturn at 22 Taurus and Uranus at 26 Taurus, close enough to be a conjunction. So she's Uranian. Jacques Vallée, born September 24, 1939, has Uranus conjunct the lunar south node in his chart. It's a little bit of a wide conjunction, but still there. Richard Dolan, born July 1, 1962, with Mars at 25 Taurus square Uranus at 28 Leo. Stephen Greer, with Uranus square Neptune and Mars conjunct Uranus. I can go on to astronaut Edgar Mitchell, born September 17, 1930. He too has Mars 12 Cancer square Uranus at 14 Aries. And then there is Admiral Thomas R. Wilson, part of the Wilson-Davis Memo lore, who was born March 4, 1946, and has the Sun at 14 Pisces and Uranus at 13 Gemini. All those people, by astrological analysis, have Uranus emphasized in their charts, and they're all seminal figures in the ufological movement. So, Mark, you fit right in.
Yeah, this is fascinating company. I love it.
It is fascinating company. And the question that we all have in our minds is, what does this Uranian influence do to people? What does it signify? Or what does it mean about where they came from in their past life histories or their missions on Earth? And it means all the things that I just touched on. It means, number one, an individual is completely competent to think outside the box, to think independently, to ask questions that perhaps nobody else thinks to ask, and to not bow to the ways of authority and conformist methods of any particular historical period of time. So it's an individual who can tolerate being on the outside or the edges, or perhaps not being understood or immediately accepted all the time. An independent thinker who is able to tolerate that position. It also indicates an awareness of cosmic and higher law. And that's because Uranus is one of the outer planets in the solar system. And astrologically, the outer planets have to do with the transcendent realms, which are beyond the tangible world that we live in. So it's an automatic indication of an awareness of these higher potentials, the possibility for quantum interactions, bilocation, parallel time zones, and things of that nature. And it also indicates that the individual has a high level of motivation to work toward accelerating human evolution. And that's the commonality in all of those situations there and all these different people that we just looked at. And so, Marc Hartzman, with your Mercury square Uranus, you fit right in the group.
That's perfect.
Yeah. Yeah, and there's some other times and situations that we can look at as well. Maybe after break, we'll come back and look at, which is in just a few minutes here, we'll come back and look at some sightings and encounters when Uranus was emphasized astrologically. But for right now, I would like to go back to you, Marc, and talk about some periods of time in your life when you were under a strong astrological activation, and see what you remember about these periods of time and how they contributed to where you are now as a writer. I'd like to first off point to the years 1993 through 1996. What can you remember about that time that stands out to you as critical on your current path?
College.
You were in college.
That was the 4 years I was in college. Yeah.
What did you study that set you on your journey?
Well, I was a dual major at Syracuse University, so that was with advertising and also political philosophy. But advertising was something that it's what I do. It's my day job, so that's the field I went into. I'm a writer, creative director, so I write commercials and other kinds of marketing ideas, programs, and so forth. So I've always been creative since I was a kid, and so I decided that would be a fun career path because basically I get paid to think of ideas and be creative, which I love. But I've always had a side project. All the books you've mentioned and we've touched on a little bit. I've always done alongside my job as side projects. And in college, I actually started a zine. Started that my senior year, and published about 18 issues of that, which led to my doing the books. So, I mean, those were, of course, 4 years of college are always critical, I think, in anybody's life. But it's interesting that you called out those 4.
Well, it was easy to do. I found those years on the basis of astrological activation. In those years, both the planets, Uranus and Neptune, which were together at that time in the zodiac in the 20s of Capricorn, were activating this Mercury-Uranus square that sits in your natal chart eternally throughout this whole incarnation. Neptune was opposing Mercury and squaring Uranus by transit or moving, or its movement at that time. And Uranus, in its movements, was directly opposing your Mercury and squaring your natal Uranus as well. So 2 of the major transcendental or spiritual planets were working on your chart in a very powerful way during that, 4-year interval that really opened up your mind to your own potential, I guess, is what it would have to be, wouldn't it?
I mean, it certainly sounds that way. Yeah, that would align with, with my path for sure.
The next date that I have for you that was astrologically, shall we say, ordained was the period 2002-2003. What can you remember from that period, 2002-2003?
Well, I got married in 2003.
That's pretty important.
Big event.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah.
Again, your chart was being activated very strongly. This time it was Pluto activating your lunar north node by a conjunction, transiting conjunction, and Uranus passing over your descendant degree and opposing your natal Mars. So what we learned from all of this is that these movements of the planets subsequent to the individual's birth really are like the hands of a clock ticking off the important times of life. And we'll come back and talk more about this after break. We're talking with author Marc Hartzman, who has just released this wonderful book on UFO history titled We Are Not Alone. We'll talk to you more after the break. Welcome back, star friends. This is astrologer Maureen Richmond, and you're listening to STARSPEAK on the UNX Digital Broadcasting Network. Tonight, I'm speaking with author Marc Hartzman, author of the recently published book, We Are Not Alone. Marc, tell our listeners where they can find your book if they want to buy it, please.
The book is available really wherever you buy books, whether it's online or in bookstores. Of course, you can go to Amazon, Barnes & Noble, bookshop.org. Any local bookstore should have it. So yeah, it should be readily available.
And it's published again by Quirk Publishers, is that right?
Yeah, Quirk Books.
Quirk
Yeah,
Books.
they published my last two books as well. So this is my third book with them. They've been a terrific partner.
Wonderful. So, star friends, if you're looking for Marc Hartzman's book, We Are Not Alone, tell your bookseller that it's published by Quirk Books, and that's what you're looking for. And I know you're going to be looking for this after you hear this discussion that we're having tonight about the content of this book and the man behind the book and the astrology behind the man. So let's continue looking at some of these life path moments that happened synchronously with astrological activation. We looked at the period 1993 to 96, and that turned out to be a time of intellectual growth for Marc while he was in college and connecting with his ability to promote ideas and develop and write ideas and be a creative thinker. And then the period 2002-3, which was when he made his important decision of life partner in marriage. So let's look now at the next phase, which was strongly indicated by astrological activation, and that was the years 2018 through 2021. Another long passage there, 2018 through 2021. What do you remember about that, Marc, that was important to your path as a writer and creative thinker?
2018, in terms of writing, let me think here. At that point, I was working on IBM for advertising, and I think around 2018 is probably when I started the Big Book of Mars. That got published in July of 2020. So I think work on the Big Book of Mars started probably early 2018, if I remember correctly, or end of 2017. I don't quite remember now.
I think I read somewhere that you were working on the Big Book of Mars in 2019, so that makes sense.
Yeah, definitely in 2019. Yeah.
So that was contained in that period too. And so that particular project took up a lot of your thinking and your time for that whole period. And that book was published when?
That was published July 2020. And then I started working on Chasing Ghosts that same month, early July, and the June 2020. So I went straight into Chasing Ghosts.
You went from Mars to Chasing Ghosts.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, the planet Pluto was working on you astrologically, and guess what? Pluto astrologically is connected to the world that was ruled by the ancient Greek god Hades, which was the underworld to which the souls of the dead went after an incarnation for a period of psychological and spiritual self-facing and purification, right? The Hades realm, under the ground, the prototype for the Western notion of another place down there, the hell region, in other words. Yep. Well, Pluto was at work on your astrological chart in 2018 through 2021, making an exact opposition to your natal Mercury. Remember, this is this important part of your chart as a writer, and squaring natal Uranus at the same time. So there again, that Mercury-Uranus square, which is such a powerful piece of your chart and who you are, was under activation astrologically when you were taking steps to pursue the themes that were of interest to you and articulate those things to the public. Again, 2018 through 2021, two of your important books were, well, conceptualized and realized during that time, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Under the influence of Pluto. You didn't know that then, though, did you?
I did not, no.
Well, that gives us a little idea. Now, there are more important passages that that you've moved through, obviously, and that you will, but that gives us an idea of how this all works in an individual's chart and how the timing works over a period of an individual's creative self-realization. Now, I'd like to share with you a little bit different look at the way Uranus works when it's influencing human affairs. And that's what I promised before the break, which is a look at some UFO sightings and encounters that occurred when the planet Uranus was strong by astrological activation. Now, these sightings and encounters are discussed in Marc Hartzman's We Are Not Alone. So if you're taking notes out there, hold on to those notes because you might want to refer to them when you get down to reading his book. And Mark, you're going to recognize these sightings and encounters. So for each one, just hop right in and talk about what you remember about that encounter and why it's important, if you would, okay?
Sure.
April 1941, Cape Girardeau, Missouri, happened when Jupiter was conjunct Uranus. Now, that's a fairly rare astrological happening. It happens once every 14 years. And in April of 1941 in Cape Girardeau, Missouri, there was apparently a UFO crash and retrieval. You want to comment on that, Mark?
I don't remember if I covered that particular case.
Okay. Yeah, that sometimes doesn't show up in the early history of the UFO movement. And because it would push the timeline back from Roswell back.
It certainly would.
Yeah. And it was an unusual situation there. Perhaps one of the first crash circumstances that occurred in the continental United States. It was discovered by some rural people. That's April 1941, Cape Girardeau, Missouri, occurring under an unusual astrological activation. And by the way, this unusual astrological activation that was in the sky in April 1941 when the Cape Girardeau event took place is going to repeat in April of 2024. And we'll talk some more about that later. Now, there was a European UFO wave in 1954. And again, Uranus was very strong astrologically. Again, Jupiter was conjunct Uranus that year, and Uranus and Neptune stood at a 90-degree separation within the zodiac. The European UFO wave. Do you remember anything that you would want to talk about there and the significance of that?
There are definitely a few European waves. I'm trying to remember which one was 1954 offhand. I know there was the Belgian triangles, but I believe that came a little bit later.
Much later. Belgian triangles in the 90s. And then 1954, it was France and Italy. Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
In September of 1961, now I know that date's going to grab you right there because you talked a lot about it. That's the Betty and Barney Hill abduction. And Uranus was very strongly active astrologically at that time with Venus conjunct Uranus. That happens about once every year, so that's not a really earth-shattering thing, though it certainly played into the event. And the transiting lunar north node conjunct Uranus, and that is unusual. That happens only once every 18 years or so. September 1961, the Betty and Barney Hill abduction, which carried a lot of significance in different ways, don't you think, Mark?
Yeah, I mean, that's definitely one of the larger more interesting abduction cases. That was the first one that was sort of documented in this country, at least. And, of course, they kept it to themselves. This wasn't made public for a few years, but they had met with a hypnotist going through hypnotic regression, trying to understand what had happened to them and try to kind of piece together the memories they were having and the experiences they were having together. And I mean, the transcripts are pretty amazing, and you can feel their the authenticity of their feelings and their emotions through those. So it's definitely a fascinating case, and definitely an interesting one that I got to write about. And I love being able to talk with Betty's niece and get her perspectives and thoughts on it as well. There's a lot of really incredible, intriguing details to that case, which is all documented, and we are not alone.
So their abduction experience ultimately ended up being rather disruptive to their life situation, don't you think?
Yeah, I mean, for sure. I don't think they wanted it to disrupt their lives. I think they were trying to just continue with their lives in their community, but things had happened and it did change them a bit.
I think that really is indicative or typical, I should say, typical of Uranian influence. It tends to break up existing patterns and shatter our pre-existing notions and confront us with a higher order reality. And you can really see that working on them. No, they just were, trying to go about their lives quietly and enjoy their companionship with each other. And boy, something else happened. September
Yeah.
1961, yeah, with a very strong Uranian activation. There was a similar Uranian activation during the Kansas City flap of 2022, when again transiting Uranus was conjunct the transiting lunar north node. And we'll get to that in a moment. But that seems to me to be a very powerful influence that comes around about once every 18 years, that the lunar node and Uranus meet together in the zodiac. Certainly it was in effect during the September 1961 period with the Betty and Barney Hill abduction. A next point in time that really brought forth the Uranian influence was the mid-1960s. That was a period of upheaval and rapid advancement in many areas of life, including technology, including UFO sightings, including the space program, and so on. But there were a couple of really outstanding sightings and encounters that occurred, or actually more than two. First, December 1965, the Kecksburg, Pennsylvania incident, which occurred with the Sun square Uranus and Uranus conjunct Pluto, a very rare configuration that only forms about every 135 years or so. Kecksburg, Pennsylvania. What do you feel like was the significance of that one, Mark?
Well, that's another case that's pretty fascinating and rather unknown what actually happened there. There was what was it that people saw and that kind of came into the ground there. It's one of those rare cases where there's really been I shouldn't say rare, but one of these cases where there's no good explanation for it, but kind of not talked about a lot, really. It's a bit more of an obscure one, but definitely an intriguing one. When you said mid-60s, my head immediately went to the various cases of UFO sightings over nuclear sites.
Yes, absolutely. I've got one right here. Minot Air Force Base, September 1966, also occurred with Uranus conjunct Pluto. Precisely. So, yeah, you want to talk about that because that's a whole big theme, isn't it?
Yeah, yeah, for sure. And I believe it was 10 days after that was the one at Malmstrom in Montana. And so, yeah, those were, in both cases, a UFO was spotted over the nuclear site. And in each case, 10 ICBMs were taken offline. And as I spoke with Robert Salas, who was at Malmstrom, and he stressed the point that it would be extremely rare for one ICBM to go offline due to a glitch. But for 10 to go offline due to glitches would be, in his terms, just incredibly rare and hard to imagine because they're not connected. It's not like a glitch would turn them all off. They're all separate. So you'd have to have 10 glitches occurring at the exact same time. And the idea of one being incredibly rare, it's hard to imagine 10 happening simultaneously. So
yeah, the odds are way against that.
Yeah. So, what was going on there? Was this some sort of, display of power that they may have been showing? Again, that's something that wasn't really looked into at the time. But Robert Salas, the retired Air Force captain who shared this story with me, all of them had to keep quiet. The story from Minot as well. There was a retired captain who spoke to me also. There was a National Press Club briefing in October 2021 where they talked about this to the public. And I mean, the stories they had were really, truly incredible. And now they're sharing them. They're not afraid to talk anymore. And the Malmstrom case came up at the congressional hearing last year in May, if I remember correctly. And the UAP task force was asked to look into it. They didn't even know what it was, which was
yes, they said they were not aware of it. Correct.
Yeah, it seemed odd. They should be if that's their job.
It is indeed. So let's go back again to that mid-1960s period. And the fact was that astrologically, that was a completely anomalous period of time itself, with Uranus and Pluto on one side of the earth and therefore conjunct. And that means astrologically, their energies were coming together. Uranus, the planet of scientific discovery and the breakthrough to new paradigms, and Pluto, the planet that deals with the continuity of life beyond the physical form. Their energies were blending and affecting the consciousness of humanity. And by golly, that was when we had these extraordinary situations where multiple UFOs hovered over nuclear weapons facilities, nuclear weapon manufacturing facilities, and storage facilities, and in some way apparently interfered with electronic communication or computer guidance systems to make it so that those weapons could not be used without touching anything, without any entities getting outside of their craft, or a craft, knocking into some tower or having impact with nothing. They're just hovering somewhere near the facility, like within a few hundred feet, and apparently exerting some type of electromagnetic force field or some other radiation that reaches into the mechanisms and does the necessary disarming. Anyway, that's the way I read it. But I can tell you the astrology behind it was extraordinary, and making the whole period of the mid-1960s also equally extraordinary in social and political ways beyond the ones that we're talking about here now. It was a time of artistic revolution, and new techniques of communication were developed. We had the rise of rock and roll during that period of time, which changed the paradigm of what music was all about. And that's just some of what happened. So yeah, these are very Uranian moments. April of 1966, the Westall School sighting in Melbourne, Australia, also occurred under the Uranus-Pluto conjunction of the mid-1960s. That was a really amazing situation, wasn't it?
Yeah, that's not one of the cases I got into in the book. Just I had limited space. I actually turned in more than I could fit in the book originally.
That's right. You covered the Ariel School sighting.
I did cover that one, yes.
Well, that one too was very Uranian. That one occurred with the Uranus-Neptune conjunction. Again, another rare astrological moment happening once every 172 years. It persists for a year or a little bit more when it finally forms, but it only forms, the conjunction between Uranus and Neptune only forms once every 172 years. And so it was in effect September of 1994 with the Ariel School sighting in Arua, Zimbabwe. Mark, you want to talk about that one?
Yeah, it's a pretty amazing case where you had, I think it was about 100 school kids who they were out playing at basically recess. Teachers were inside of the faculty meeting, and the kids see an object lower down, just off of the field that they're playing in, and saw creatures come out of it, some sort of humanoid type creature. And, like I said, it was about 100 witnesses saw this thing. Not everybody saw it, but that's a pretty good number to see something. And they ran in, told the teachers what they had seen. And teachers, I think, initially, thought they were just being imaginative, but eventually went out to check it out. Of course, by then everything was gone. Dr. John Mack, a Harvard psychologist, went out to visit. He was very much fascinated by the idea of alien visitation and abduction and so forth. So he interviewed these kids, and the kids were all drawing images. And I have a few of the drawings in the book, and you'll see that they were drawing very similar types of creatures and craft that they claimed to have witnessed. And John Mack believed what they were saying. And those kids, I mean, you can still hear them talk today as adults. Many of them are talking about, they maintain everything they saw. And again, it's one of these cases that has no real clear explanation as to what exactly they experienced or saw.
Yes, and astrologically, we have a hint here. It occurred with the Uranus-Neptune conjunction, which strongly suggests that a new order of reality, a different world, a completely transcendent vision was coming into focus, or coming into the experience of humanity at that time. Breakthrough into a new paradigm. That's what Uranus always does. It was discovered in the late 1700s and coincided with the onset of the Industrial Revolution, modern technology, and the scientific method. And so it's all about this sudden realization about the laws operating in the cosmos and in the the greater environment that we exist in. So that was really operating very strongly in September of 1994 with that sighting with that children, with the Uranus-Neptune conjunction, which was in effect and very strong at that time. Varginha, Brazil. That's one of your sightings that you discuss, isn't it?
Yes, that's another fun, interesting case where, again, this Brazil actually has a lot of sightings. This was the one I covered, though, where people claim to have encountered an alien creature. Three girls kind of walking back from work on their way home, and saw this creature sort of huddled up by a wall, like in some brush, and described him as being smelly. Was one of the descriptions. It's very stinky.
Mm-hmm.
But also just very unusual. Again, kind of humanoid. And there's interesting details of that case where I think there was another one that was found and picked up by I believe by the fire department, and policemen I think had touched one and seemed to have some sort of health issues after that. People saw something before all this happened. Before all these sightings of the creatures, people were calling in sightings of some sort of unusual craft just outside of town. So again, no clear explanation, but a lot of seemingly cover-up types of operations happening around the case. And that town, like Roswell, that town has completely embraced the lore of what happened there. And if you were to go there, you'd see, I think, a lot of alien-themed decorations, souvenirs, and so forth all over town, just like you'll see in Roswell, which is great that they've embraced it and kind of capitalized on this at this point.
I think there was a film made about that too, wasn't it? Moment of Contact.
Yeah, it just came out, I think, earlier this year.
James Fox, right?
Yes, yeah. Who also actually no, the Ariel School actually just came out as a documentary also, by Randall Nickerson.
Yeah, so in the Varginha case, again, the planet Uranus was strongly activated astrologically. The Sun and Uranus were precisely conjunct on the days when this event that Mark just described was transpiring. It was in January of 1996 with the Sun conjunct Uranus. Now, that happens once every year, so that's not an exceedingly rare astrological influence, but it was certainly happening when this highly anomalous circumstance evolved that Mark just described there in Brazil. I've just got a couple more that we're going to mention quickly here. April 2021, the 29 Palms, California, sighting by 50 Marines. We have clock time for that, so a full chart can be calculated, and it shows the planet Uranus smack on the descendant. The implication is not that the Marines were seeing the planet Uranus. No, it's that the power of the Uranian archetype was strongly at work in that moment, destroying previous assumptions and breaking through to a new level of perception and understanding. So that was April 2021, the 29 Palms, and then the August 2022 Kansas City flap, which was a period of time in which a number of sightings were made in the area of Kansas City, Kansas. These sightings, I believe, if I remember, went on for 2-3 weeks, if not a month. And all during that period, there was a triple conjunction of Mars, the transiting lunar north node, and you got it, the planet Uranus. So that was, again, a very strongly Uranian period. It's highly unusual that all three of those factors would come together in the zodiac. Now, Uranus and the transiting lunar north node do that once every 18 years. And Mars and Uranus come to a conjunction in the zodiac once every 2 years. But for all three of them to arrive at the same place at the same time astrologically is very rare. So with that astrological rarity, there was also a highly unique and basically mind-blowing period of time that occurred in the Kansas City area. That was known as the Kansas City flap. So that gives you a little idea from our discussion of these encounters and sightings about the power of Uranus to generate these experiences in which the intellectual and spiritual and scientific paradigms by which we live are challenged and tested, possibly even blown to bits with some type of manifestation or experience that opens human consciousness to a confrontation with other dimensions, other truths, other types of being, other planetary civilizations, other humanities around other stars or maybe from other galaxies. And the possibilities really are quite endless, aren't they, Mark, as to what actually UFO manifestations really are?
Yeah, I mean, the topic truly is endlessly fascinating, and this is such an interesting side to look at it, the different lens to look at through, which is, it's incredible.
It is interesting, and I think really the validity of what I'm talking about really rests on the notion of synchronicity, which was a principle that was brought to humanity, or an idea that was brought to humanity by 20th century depth psychologist Carl Jung. Actually, he was a psychiatrist. He was an MD before he was a therapist, so he's a psychiatrist. Anyway, he talked about synchronicity as a critical, pivotal, central idea that we need for understanding human experience. And it posited that when two things happen at the same time, they are inherently related. So we have these two things happening at the same time. The arrangement of the celestial bodies in the solar system relative to planet Earth, that's one thing. And then the second thing is extraordinary experiences of humanity, which we call UFO sightings and encounters. So those are the two things that frequently happen at the same time. Really, actually, what I'm showing you is what was happening in the sky at the time that these known events did occur. So those are synchronous happenings, and according to the principle of synchronicity, they are inherently related. So the relationship is between these celestial bodies and these happenings. We can also see these celestial bodies as archetypes. So then the relationship is between these archetypes and these experiences. But whatever the case is, the principle of synchronicity is absolutely essential for understanding these levels of experience. So yeah, I think that's what we're looking at here. We're looking at astrology as a key, one of many keys to understanding the nature of these experiences, what they're supposed to be about, what they can do for us, and also their potentially disruptive and uncomfortable side effects of what happens when we make these huge leaps of evolutionary understanding. Mark, it's been absolutely wonderful speaking with you tonight. Thank you so much for coming on STARSPEAK. This is astrologer Maureen Richmond, and I'm signing off now. And Mark, would you like to bid adieu to our listeners?
Yeah, thank you so much for having me, Maureen. This was great, and thanks all for listening. And We Are Not Alone is available at bookstores everywhere, Amazon.com or wherever you buy books.
Thank you so much, Mark. It's been a pleasure to speak with you here. This is astrologer Maureen Richmond signing off for STARSPEAK on the UNX Digital Broadcasting Network.